cemeteries oddly peaceful. The one near my house, with its ancient iron gates and weathered tombstones, was my favorite spot for evening walks. That day, the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the graves. Birds chirped in the distance, and the faint rustle of leaves filled the air. I walked slowly, reading names on the stones, imagining their stories. It was a ritual that brought me comfort. As I reached the old gate to leave, I noticed something strange. The gate, which always creaked loudly when pushed open, was slightly ajar and completely silent. A chill ran down my spine as I hesitated. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move behind it. But when I blinked, it was gone. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped closer to inspect the gate. The iron bars were cold to the touch, almost unnaturally so for a warm evening. As I peered through the gap, I felt an inexplicable sense of dread. Beyond the gate, the path leading out of the cemetery seemed darker than usual, as if the shadows had thickened unnaturally. Then I saw it, a figure standing motionless at the edge of the path. It was tall and human-like, but lacked any discernible features in the fading light. My heart raced as I called out nervously, "Hello? Is someone there?" The figure didn't respond or move, but seemed to grow taller as I stared at it. Panic set in, and I turned to leave, but my legs felt heavy as if rooted to the ground. Finally breaking free from my paralysis, I stumbled backward and ran toward the center of the cemetery. My breath came in short gasps as adrenaline coursed through me. The figure hadn't followed, or at least I thought so, but its presence lingered in my mind like a dark stain. Reaching a large oak tree near an old mausoleum, I stopped to catch my breath. The air felt colder now, and an eerie silence had replaced the usual evening sounds. No birds chirped, no leaves rustled. It was as if the world had paused around me. Then came a sound, a faint whisper carried by the wind. It was too soft to make out words, but unmistakably human. My skin crawled as I realized it was coming from behind me. I spun around quickly, but saw nothing except rows of graves stretching into the misty distance. The whispering grew louder now, more distinct yet still incomprehensible. It sounded like multiple voices speaking at once, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of despair. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone to use its flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness but revealed nothing unusual, just gravestones and overgrown grass swaying gently in an unseen breeze. "This isn't real," I muttered to myself, trying to steady my breathing. But deep down, I knew something unnatural was happening here tonight. Determined to leave this nightmare behind, I made my way back toward the gate as quickly as possible without breaking into a full sprint. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if unseen hands were trying to hold me back. When I finally reached the gate again, relief flooded through me, until I noticed it was now fully closed and chained shut with a rusted padlock that hadn't been there before. My stomach dropped as panic set in once more. How could this be? I hadn't heard anyone approach or seen anyone near enough to lock it while I'd been inside. Desperation took over as I shook and pulled at the chains with all my strength, but they didn't budge an inch. The whispers returned louder than ever now, angry and insistent, and seemed to surround me completely like an invisible storm closing in on all sides. Tears streamed down my face as fear overwhelmed me entirely for what felt like hours but was likely only minutes. I collapsed to my knees, my breath ragged and uneven. The whispers were deafening now, circling me like a vortex of sound. I covered my ears, but it made no difference. They were inside my head. "What do you want from me?" I screamed into the darkness. For a moment, the voices stopped. The silence was almost worse, heavy and oppressive. Then, one voice spoke clearly, deep and resonant. "You must stay." My blood ran cold as the words echoed around me. "Stay? Why?" I didn't belong here. As I looked up at the gate again, I saw the figure standing on the other side, its form clearer now. It was tall and skeletal, with glowing red eyes that pierced through the gloom. The figure raised one bony hand and pointed toward the center of the cemetery. My body moved against my will, compelled by an unseen force. My legs carried me back toward the mausoleum I had passed earlier, even as my mind screamed to stop. The air grew colder with every step, and a thick fog began to creep along the ground, swirling around my feet like ghostly tendrils. When I reached the mausoleum, its heavy stone door was ajar, revealing a dark passageway leading downward. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. But the voice returned, louder this time. "Enter." My body obeyed before I could resist, stepping into the cold darkness beyond. The air inside was damp and smelled of earth and decay. My flashlight flickered as I descended a narrow staircase carved into the stone. The whispers returned, softer now but more insistent, guiding me deeper into the crypt. The walls were lined with ancient carvings, symbols I didn't recognize but that filled me with unease. At the bottom of the stairs was a small chamber lit by an eerie green glow emanating from an object in the center. It was a key, large and ornate, made of blackened metal that seemed to pulse with energy. As I approached it, the whispers stopped abruptly. I hesitated before picking up the key, but something about it felt magnetic, as if it was calling to me personally. The moment my fingers closed around it, a searing pain shot through my hand. I dropped it instinctively and looked down to see a glowing mark burned into my palm, the same symbol I had seen on the carvings earlier. The key floated back into place on its pedestal as if untouched by gravity. Suddenly, a deep rumble shook the chamber, and dust rained down from above. "You have been chosen," said the voice again, louder than ever before. The floor beneath me began to crack as if something massive was trying to break free from below. Panic surged through me as I turned to run back up the stairs, but they were gone, replaced by solid stone walls that trapped me inside. The green glow intensified until it filled every corner of the chamber, blinding me completely. Then came a deafening roar that sounded like it came from deep within the earth itself. When I opened my eyes again, everything was still, but different. The crypt was gone. I was standing in an open field under a starless sky. I turned in circles, trying to make sense of where I was or how I had gotten there. In every direction stretched endless rows of graves, far more than there had been in the cemetery before. Each headstone glowed faintly with green light like fireflies in the dark. Then I noticed something horrifying. Names on some of them were familiar. Friends and family members who were still alive when I had last seen them earlier that day. "No," I whispered in disbelief as tears streamed down my face. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of nightmare or hallucination. But as I stepped closer to one of the graves bearing my mother's name, fresh soil shifted slightly as if something beneath it had moved. A skeletal hand burst through the dirt without warning, clawing at the air desperately before sinking back down again just as quickly as it had appeared. My scream echoed across the field as more graves began to stir around me, hands and faces emerging briefly before disappearing again like ghosts trapped in an eternal struggle for freedom. The whispers returned one final time. "You are their keeper now." The weight of those words crushed me as realization dawned. I wasn't meant to leave this place alive. The key's mark on my hand burned brighter than ever as chains made of shadow wrapped around my wrists and ankles, anchoring me to this cursed land forevermore. It was early morning when I decided to visit my grandmother's grave. The cemetery was blanketed in a thick, suffocating mist that clung to the air like a ghostly shroud. I could barely see a few feet ahead of me, but I knew the path by heart. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked, the sound unervingly loud in the stillness. Something about the fog felt different that day, heavier, almost alive. I shook off the unease and focused on the bouquet of flowers in my hand. "Just a quick visit," I whispered to myself, trying to ignore the growing knot in my stomach. But as I approached her grave, I noticed something strange. The flowers I had left last week were scattered across the ground, as if someone or something had disturbed them. I knelt down to gather the wilted petals, feeling a pang of sadness and frustration. Who would do this? The cemetery was always so quiet and undisturbed. As I rearranged the flowers, I noticed faint footprints in the damp soil near the grave, small and barefoot, leading deeper into the mist. My pulse quickened as I stood and looked around, but there was no one in sight. "Hello," I called out hesitantly, my voice barely breaking through the dense fog. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, faintly, I heard it, a soft giggle, high-pitched and childlike, coming from somewhere ahead. My heart raced as I debated whether to follow it or leave immediately. Against my better judgment, I stepped off the path and followed the footprints into the mist. The giggle came again, closer this time, sending chills down my spine. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The fog seemed to thicken with every step, swallowing up the world around me until all I could see were shadows of headstones looming like specters in the distance. The sound of my own breathing grew louder in my ears as an oppressive silence settled over everything once more. Then came another sound, soft and rhythmic, like someone humming a lullaby just out of sight. The melody was hauntingly familiar, tugging at memories buried deep within me. It was a song my grandmother used to hum when I was a child, a tune that had always brought me comfort. But here, in this eerie place, it felt wrong. My legs trembled as I moved closer to where the sound seemed to be coming from. Through the mist, I saw a figure sitting on a low gravestone, a small girl with long hair obscuring her face. She wore a tattered white dress that looked soaked from the damp air around us. "Are you lost?" I asked cautiously, taking another step forward. The girl didn't respond or move. She just kept humming that unsettling tune. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but something about her felt magnetic, as if she needed help and couldn't ask for it herself. "It's okay," I said softly, crouching down to her level. "I can help you find your family." Slowly, she lifted her head to look at me, and that's when I saw her eyes. Hollow sockets where her pupils should have been, black and endless like bottomless pits. My breath caught in my throat as she smiled, a wide grin that didn't reach those empty eyes, and whispered, "They're already here." Before I could react, she vanished into thin air like smoke dissipating in the wind. My body froze as icy fear gripped me completely. Then came another giggle, this time from behind me, and when I turned around, there were more footprints leading away from where she had been sitting. They weren't alone now. Larger prints accompanied them as if someone, or several people, were walking alongside her barefoot through the mud. I stumbled backward toward what I thought was safety, the main path, but it was gone now, swallowed by the ever-thickening mist. Panic surged through me as whispers began to fill the air around me, faint voices overlapping one another like an unintelligible chorus of despair and malice. "Leave," one voice hissed clearly above the others before dissolving back into chaotic murmurs. Desperate to escape this nightmare, I ran blindly through the fog without any sense of direction. The whispers followed me relentlessly like shadows clinging to my heels. My foot caught on something, a root or perhaps an old grave marker, and I fell hard onto cold stone ground beneath me. I groaned as I pushed myself up, my palms scraped and stinging. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against my ears like a heavy weight. I looked around, trying to orient myself, but the mist was thicker than ever. Then I noticed where I had fallen, a grave unlike any I had seen before. Its headstone was cracked and covered in moss, but the name etched into it was unmistakable. My breath hitched as I stared at the letters, disbelief and terror warring within me. "This isn't real," I muttered shakily, backing away from the grave. But as I moved, the ground beneath me shifted unnaturally, as though something was stirring just below the surface. The soil began to crumble, and a skeletal hand burst through the dirt, clawing at the air. I screamed and stumbled backward, watching in horror as more hands emerged, their bony fingers grasping desperately. They were pulling themselves out, figures with empty eye sockets and gaping mouths that seemed to silently scream. My legs felt like lead as I tried to run, but the mist seemed to thicken around me, slowing my movements. One of the figures lunged toward me, its hand brushing against my ankle with an icy grip that sent jolts of pain through my body. "Help us," it rasped in a voice that sounded like dry leaves scraping together. I broke free and ran blindly again, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. The mist parted slightly ahead of me, revealing a familiar sight, the mausoleum at the center of the cemetery. Its heavy stone doors were open just enough for me to see darkness inside, beckoning me like a void. I didn't want to go in, but something compelled me forward. As I stepped closer, I heard faint crying coming from within, a child's sobs echoing off the stone walls. "Please," the voice whimpered. It sounded like the girl from before. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I stepped inside. The air inside was cold and damp, carrying the metallic scent of decay. My footsteps echoed loudly as I descended a narrow staircase that spiraled downward into darkness. The crying grew louder with each step until it became almost unbearable, raw and filled with anguish. At the bottom of the stairs was a small chamber lit by flickering candles arranged in a circle around an old wooden coffin. The girl stood beside it now, her hollow eyes fixed on me. "You came," she said softly, her voice devoid of emotion. "You shouldn't have." Before I could respond, She pointed to the coffin and whispered, "Open it." I shook my head violently. "No," I said firmly, backing away toward the stairs. But as soon as I turned around, they were gone, replaced by solid stone walls that trapped me inside. The girl's expression didn't change as she repeated her command, "Open it." My hands trembled uncontrollably as if some unseen force was guiding them toward the coffin's lid despite my resistance. When my fingers touched the wood, it felt ice-cold and pulsed faintly beneath my touch like a heartbeat. With great effort, I lifted the lid and immediately wished I hadn't. Inside lay a decayed corpse dressed in tattered clothing that looked eerily familiar, because it was mine. My own lifeless face stared back at me with empty sockets where eyes should have been. A scream tore from my throat as reality seemed to fracture around me. The girl smiled faintly now and said in that same hollow voice, "You've always been here." The whispers returned then, louder than ever, filling my mind with fragmented memories of this place that didn't belong to me but felt hauntingly real. The room began to collapse around us as cracks spread across the walls and floor like spiderwebs. The girl stepped into the coffin beside my corpse and lay down peacefully before whispering one final word, "Stay." The candles extinguished themselves all at once, plunging everything into darkness. When I opened my eyes again, I was standing outside in the misty cemetery once more, but something was different now. The graves were silent. No whispers followed me anymore. As I turned toward the exit gate, I caught my reflection in a puddle nearby and saw those same hollow eyes staring back at me. I've worked as a gravedigger for over 20 years. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work. The cemetery was always quiet, a place where the dead rested peacefully and the living rarely lingered. I liked it that way. My shift started at dusk, and I often worked late into the night under the pale glow of the moon. That particular evening seemed no different. The air was crisp, and the scent of damp earth filled my nostrils as I prepared to dig a fresh grave. The headstone had already been placed, a simple marker with no name, just a date, October 31st, 1876. I paused, puzzled by the omission. "Strange," I muttered, but shrugged it off. The dead didn't care about such things, or so I thought. As my shovel struck the ground, an unnatural chill swept over me, raising goosebumps on my arms despite the warm night. I stopped digging and looked around, but the cemetery was empty as usual. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their shadows dancing across the tombstones. Shaking off the unease, I resumed my work. The soil was unusually heavy that night, clinging to my shovel like wet clay. After what felt like hours, I hit something solid, wood. "Already," I muttered to myself. But when I cleared away more dirt, my stomach dropped. There was already a coffin buried here, a coffin that shouldn't have been there. I stared at the coffin in disbelief. It was old, its wood darkened and splintered with age. No one had mentioned an existing burial plot here. This grave was supposed to be empty. My first instinct was to notify the caretaker in the morning and leave it alone for now. But curiosity got the better of me. Kneeling down, I brushed away more dirt until the entire lid was exposed. That's when I noticed something carved into the wood, a series of strange symbols that looked neither religious nor decorative, more like warnings. The symbols seemed to pulse faintly under the moonlight, as if alive with some hidden energy. My hands trembled as I reached out to touch them, but before my fingers made contact, a low groan echoed from beneath the earth. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't wind or shifting soil, it sounded human, guttural, and pained. "Hello," I called out instinctively, though I knew how absurd it was to expect an answer from beneath 6 feet of dirt. To my horror, something knocked from inside the coffin, 3 sharp raps that sent me stumbling backward. I scrambled to my feet, dropping my shovel in panic as the knocking continued, louder now and more insistent. Every rational part of me screamed to run, but something rooted me in place. "Is someone alive in there?" My voice shook as I spoke aloud to no one in particular. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so profound it pressed against my ears like a weight. Then came a whisper, a raspy voice that seemed to seep into my very bones. "Let me out." My blood turned to ice as those words echoed in my mind. "No," I whispered back without thinking, shaking my head violently as if denying it would make it go away. But the voice returned louder this time. "Let me out." The ground beneath me began to tremble slightly as if responding to its command. Against every ounce of common sense, I found myself stepping closer to the coffin again, compelled by an unseen force stronger than fear or reason. With trembling hands, I pried at the edges of the lid, using my shovel as leverage until it creaked open slightly, just enough for a sliver of moonlight to illuminate what lay inside. At first glance, it appeared empty except for a tattered black cloth draped across its interior like a shroud. But then something moved, a shadow shifting unnaturally within the confined space. The shadow rose slowly from within the coffin like smoke curling upward into form, a figure cloaked entirely in darkness with eyes that glowed faintly red against its void-like body. My breath caught in my throat as it turned those eyes on me and spoke again. "You have freed me." Its voice was no longer a whisper but a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through every fiber of my being. Finally breaking free from my paralysis, I turned and ran as fast as I could, leaving my shovel and tools behind. The cemetery seemed endless now, the paths twisting and turning in ways they never had before. Tombstones loomed out of the mist like jagged teeth, and the air grew colder with every step I took. Behind me, I could hear the figure's voice echoing through the night. "You cannot escape." Its words sent shivers down my spine, but I didn't dare look back. My lungs burned as I pushed forward, desperate to find the gate and leave this nightmare behind. When I finally reached the cemetery gate, relief flooded through me, until I realized it was locked. The heavy iron chains that secured it hadn't been there earlier in the evening. "No, no, no," I muttered frantically, pulling at the chains with all my strength. They didn't budge. The shadowy figure was closer now. I could feel its presence pressing against me like a weight. Turning around, I saw it hovering just a few feet away, its red eyes glowing brighter than before. "There is no leaving," it said simply. "You belong here now." Desperation overtook me as I searched for another way out. My eyes landed on a small gap in the fence near an old oak tree, a spot where the iron bars had rusted away over time. Without thinking, I bolted toward it, squeezing through just as the figure lunged at me. Its shadowy tendrils brushed against my back, sending a jolt of icy pain through my body. But I made it out, collapsing onto the damp grass outside the cemetery walls. For a moment, all was silent except for my ragged breathing. I thought I was safe until I noticed something horrifying. The shadowy figure was still visible on the other side of the fence, staring at me with those unrelenting red eyes. It didn't try to cross, but instead raised one skeletal hand and pointed directly at me. "You cannot outrun what you've unleashed," it said ominously before fading into the darkness of the cemetery. My relief turned to dread as its words echoed in my mind. What had I done? And what did it mean by unleashed? Over the next few days, strange things began happening around me. At first, it was subtle, shadows moving where there shouldn't have been any, or whispers in empty rooms late at night. Then it escalated. Objects in my house would shift on their own, mirrors would crack when I looked into them, and every night in my dreams, those glowing red eyes would appear, watching me silently from the darkness. It became clear that whatever I had freed from that coffin wasn't bound to the cemetery. It had followed me home. I couldn't take it anymore. Guilt and fear consumed me as I realized there was only one way to end this nightmare. I had to return to the cemetery and confront whatever curse I had unleashed. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and trembling resolve, I made my way back to that cursed graveyard under a moonless sky. The coffin was still there, open and empty as if waiting for me. The shadowy figure appeared once more, its form towering over me like a storm cloud ready to strike. "You cannot undo what has been done," it said coldly. But as its tendrils reached for me again, I noticed something, a faint glow emanating from beneath the coffin's lid, an ancient amulet buried within the wood itself. I never believed in ghosts or curses. To me, cemeteries were just places where the dead rested and the living mourned. That's why I agreed to help my friend Ethan explore the old cemetery on the edge of town. He was obsessed with urban legends, and this one was no different, a crypt hidden deep within the cemetery that supposedly housed something too terrible to name. "It's just a story," I told him as we climbed over the rusted gate late one night. The moon was high, casting an eerie glow over the rows of weathered tombstones. The air was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Ethan grinned, holding up his flashlight. "Then you've got nothing to worry about, right?" The cemetery was larger than I expected, its layout a confusing maze of crumbling mausoleums and leaning headstones. Ethan led the way with unshakable confidence, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "It's supposed to be somewhere near the center," he said, consulting a hand-drawn map he'd found online. I followed reluctantly, every crunch of gravel beneath my boots making me flinch. The deeper we went, the colder it became. My breath puffed out in visible clouds, even though it was early autumn. "Do you feel that?" I asked, rubbing my arms for warmth. Ethan shrugged, too focused on his map to notice the chill creeping into my bones. After what felt like hours of wandering, we found it, a crypt half-sunken into the earth, its entrance obscured by overgrown ivy and moss. It looked ancient, older than anything else in the cemetery. The stone door was carved with strange symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly in the moonlight. "This is it," Ethan whispered, his excitement palpable. I hesitated as unease prickled at the back of my neck. "Maybe we shouldn't go in," I said, but Ethan was already pulling at the heavy stone door. With a groan, it slid open just enough for us to squeeze through, revealing a dark staircase spiraling downward into the earth. The air inside was damp and stale, carrying a metallic tang that made my stomach churn. Our flashlights illuminated walls covered in more of those strange carvings, symbols that seemed to shift when I looked at them for too long. "This is incredible," Ethan said, his voice echoing off the stone walls. I didn't share his enthusiasm. Every step down felt like a descent into something we weren't meant to find. At the bottom of the stairs was a narrow hallway lined with alcoves containing skeletal remains draped in tattered cloth. "It's just an old burial crypt," I said, trying to convince myself as much as him. But then we reached the end of the hallway, and everything changed. The final chamber was massive, its ceiling disappearing into darkness above us. In its center stood an ornate stone sarcophagus surrounded by unlit candles arranged in a perfect circle. Unlike the rest of the crypt, this room felt untouched by time. No dust, no decay. Ethan approached eagerly while I hung back near the entrance, every instinct screaming at me to leave. "Look at this," he called out, running his fingers over intricate carvings on the sarcophagus lid. They depicted scenes of people bowing before a towering figure cloaked in shadow, a figure whose face was obscured but whose presence radiated malice even in stone. "Don't touch anything," I warned him as he leaned closer to inspect an inscription etched along the edge of the lid. "Relax," he said dismissively, pulling out his phone to take pictures. But as soon as his fingers brushed against one of the carvings, a low rumble echoed through the chamber like distant thunder. We both froze as cracks began to spread across the floor beneath us, glowing faintly with an eerie red light. "What did you do?" I shouted over the growing noise, but Ethan didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on something behind me. I turned slowly and felt my blood run cold. The skeletal remains in the alcoves lining the hallway had begun to move, bony hands clawing their way free from centuries-old bindings as hollow eye sockets turned toward us with unnatural awareness. "We need to leave," I yelled, grabbing Ethan's arm and dragging him toward the stairs. But before we could reach them, a deafening crash filled the chamber as the sarcophagus lid shattered into pieces. From within rose a figure cloaked in darkness so thick it seemed to absorb our flashlight beams entirely. Its form shifted constantly, one moment humanoid, the next monstrous, its presence filling every corner of the chamber with suffocating dread. A voice echoed in my mind rather than my ears. "Asterisk, you have disturbed my slumber." Asterisk, my legs buckled under its weight as Ethan stood frozen beside me, his face pale with terror. I never believed in ghosts or curses. To me, cemeteries were just places where the dead rested and the living mourned. That's why I agreed to help my friend Ethan explore the old cemetery on the edge of town. He was obsessed with urban legends, and this one was no different, a crypt hidden deep within the cemetery that supposedly housed something too terrible to name. "It's just a story," I told him as we climbed over the rusted gate late one night. The moon was high, casting an eerie glow over the rows of weathered tombstones. The air was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Ethan grinned, holding up his flashlight. "Then you've got nothing to worry about, right?" The cemetery was larger than I expected, its layout a confusing maze of crumbling mausoleums and leaning headstones. Ethan led the way with unshakable confidence, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "It's supposed to be somewhere near the center," he said, consulting a hand-drawn map he'd found online. I followed reluctantly, every crunch of gravel beneath my boots making me flinch. The deeper we went, the colder it became. My breath puffed out in visible clouds, even though it was early autumn. "Do you feel that?" I asked, rubbing my arms for warmth. Ethan shrugged, too focused on his map to notice the chill creeping into my bones. After what felt like hours of wandering, we found it, a crypt half sunken into the earth, its entrance obscured by overgrown ivy and moss. It looked ancient, older than anything else in the cemetery. The stone door was carved with strange symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly in the moonlight. "This is it," Ethan whispered, his excitement palpable. I hesitated as unease prickled at the back of my neck. "Maybe we shouldn't go in," I said, but Ethan was already pulling at the heavy stone door. With a groan, it slid open just enough for us to squeeze through, revealing a dark staircase spiraling downward into the earth. The air inside was damp and stale, carrying a metallic tang that made my stomach churn. Our flashlights illuminated walls covered in more of those strange carvings, symbols that seemed to shift when I looked at them for too long. "This is incredible," Ethan said, his voice echoing off the stone walls. I didn't share his enthusiasm. Every step down felt like a descent into something we weren't meant to find. At the bottom of the stairs was a narrow hallway lined with alcoves containing skeletal remains draped in tattered cloth. "It's just an old burial crypt," I said, trying to convince myself as much as him. But then we reached the end of the hallway, and everything changed. The final chamber was massive, its ceiling disappearing into darkness above us. In its center stood an ornate stone sarcophagus surrounded by unlit candles arranged in a perfect circle.